And maybe just as a quick intro, the Institute, as many of you will know if you're members, subscribed to a new code of ethics and professional conduct a year or two ago. Through the Social and Ethics Committee and its chair, Josina Overdevest, we recently commissioned a new video to be created talking about ethics in IT. It only runs for 3 minutes, so we ask you to sit back and join us in perhaps just thinking a little differently about our profession. So thank you for that, and we'll go off on that right away.
As professionals in the world of information technology, we use our creativity, skills, and understanding of the world around us to make change. Each piece of code, technology, or information that we send out into the world takes on a life that has the potential to change the world around it. In our fast-paced world of AI, robotics, media, and communications, the actions we take dictate the future of these technologies. These technologies significantly impact people and the environment around us. As we grow, understand, and adopt AI both in our work and personal lives, we will be presented with moral and pragmatic decisions that can be used either in the upliftment or to the detriment of those around us. In everything we do, it is important to visualize, study, and calculate the impact that our creations will have. The fundamental way to achieve this is by imagining the impact your actions could have on you, your family, community, and society. Personal information can be readily stolen through phishing, viruses, and malware, leading to psychological, social, and financial harm to individuals. This abuse of personal information poses a threat not only to the affected individuals, but also to organizations at large. Imagine if this happened to you or your loved ones. We often underestimate the significance of our work, yet it's crucial to recognize that we are at the forefront of innovation. We play a pivotal role in propelling our world forward and shaping the future. We have the ability to mold our future into one that is filled with darkness, destruction, inequality, and unsustainability. It doesn't have to be this way, though. By using our skills, tools, and insights into the impacts our actions have on the world around us, we can build the future into something beautiful and exciting. A future that does not only benefit us, but benefits society and the generations that will come after us. We as information technology professionals can do this by always considering the ethical impacts of our actions. If you work in the ICT sector in South Africa, consider joining thousands of IT professionals committed to developing their unique skills across various sectors, all working towards building a stronger and more sustainable future for the greater good. To apply for membership with IITPSA, visit www.iitpsa.org.za.
And there we have it. So, Quentin, over to you.
Great, thanks, Tony. So I guess you'll put the slides up, but before we do that, I'd like to welcome Eben. So I'll just give you a quick overview of Eben and his career. So Eben's been affiliated with the data center industry since 1999, and he has a broad range of knowledge across power, cooling systems, and spent a significant amount of time with the American Power Conversion Corporation, which is APC, in 2000, as the district manager for Southern Africa. He then relocated to the UK in 2004, where he used his skills in APC UK and Ireland as a systems engineer. And then after designing and deploying a number of data centers across the UK, Eben decided to join Data Sentience, which is a data center consultancy in London. And after that moved to Emerson Network Power, or what we now know as Vertiv, in 2008. And then Eben moved back to South Africa, where he spent 3 years with Schneider Electric as an enterprise and solutions manager for Southern Africa, before joining FIAMM or FZ Sonic, which is an Italian battery manufacturer, as the country manager in Africa, with a close affiliation to UPS and battery systems. In 2018, Eben joined the Uptime Institute as a sales director for English Speaking Africa. And he's married with 3 kids. He's an avid electronics hobbyist and enthusiast, and also enjoys the outdoors. So today, Eben is going to be talking to us about tier certification and the need for data center resilience and standards. So help me welcome Eben in the chat, and I look forward to a very insightful discussion. Thank you.
Well, Quentin, I don't think I could have done that any better, my friend. That was an absolute fantastic welcoming, and thank you to you and the team. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, correct. My name is Eben Owen. That is me in the photograph on the first slide. And as Quentin correctly said, I've been in the data center industry since 1999. It's amazing how these numbers can make you feel very old, when you reflect back on a very rich and prosperous career. So quite correct. The Uptime Institute focuses on tiering and standards, but I would like to share with you today a little bit more about the need for resilience. I think all the conversations and discussions that we have today with CIOs, with IT, data center IT managers, the number one imperative for their organizations and for IT in particular is obviously business continuity. And I think we sometimes forget and neglect the importance of the physical layer. We're going to talk a little bit today about what we call the digital infrastructure. And of course, the topology around the arrangements of digital infrastructure and how that can actually help you achieve greater levels of resilience within your data centers. So you probably recall that a lot of data center managers and CIOs talk about 5 nines. Well, that's a measure of data center resilience. And in fact, we'll take the credit for that. It's a statistical analysis of what resilience you should actually expect out of your digital infrastructure. So, as you know, it's not just the data center that needs to be taken into consideration. And this is why it is a difficult task today to be in IT. And I think we probably have 1 or 2 IT managers on the call today. This is a holistic view that needs to be taken across the entire organization, starting with the data center as pretty much the base level upon which we then build our levels of resilience. And it's quite interesting to see that through the years there's been so many different angles that CIOs and data center managers had to face. We're seeing disruptive technologies. We're seeing AI that's coming into play that actually is starting to turn the IT industry on its head. And in fact, even at the physical layer, we're starting to see that AI is being considered as probably the most disruptive technology that would change the way in which we design and build data centers in the future. Predictions are at this particular point in time that AI would even exceed 70 kilowatts in a rack, and even more than that, which obviously calls for new ways in which we power and cool data centers in particular. Your standard way of cooling is just not going to suffice in cooling high power densities at that level. So I'm going to take you through a couple of very interesting findings. You're welcome to go to the uptimeinstitute.com. There's a resource section, and under the resource section, you'll see the 2023 data center survey results, which actually links quite nicely. It's very, very vendor agnostic. We're a vendor agnostic organization, but we ask the hard questions. And, the interesting information that we get from an international panel of people that took part in this survey is quite revealing in terms of where the industry is moving. So linking to a very complex industry that we are dealing with is that we in spite of the fact that we are getting better at building data centers and building better resilience levels into our facilities, we are still experiencing outages. So the questionnaire basically asked 781 participants if they've experienced an outage and what would they classify the severity to be. So 55% of the participants actually came back and said that they did experience an outage in 2023. And of that, 4% actually explained to us that it was quite severe. So again, it just proves that, you know, data center resilience can never be overlooked and should be taken into consideration from the offset when you start with a design in your facilities. So the next slide basically talks about the financial impact that these outages had across the participants. And although we're getting better and although the outages are becoming less, it appears to be more costly for organizations to go down. And I think that is quite a horrific statistic. If you look at 16% of the participants that experienced an outage in 2023 had $1 million plus revenue loss due to an outage. And I think it's important for us to also do a post-mortem, and we'll look at some of the next slides. How do we go about to actually try and find out where these outages occurred and what we can actually do, to cover for that in the future. A little bit closer to home, you'll probably remember the story about Capitec. A couple of years ago, I think it was roughly about 2 years ago, had a very, very strange IT challenge, if you want to call it that. Those who were using the Capitec application on their mobile phones basically did a financial transfer to somebody else, to a beneficiary. The funds were out of your particular account, but it never actually reflected in the recipient's account, and it was somewhere stuck in cyberspace. The problem is that ultimately it proves yet again that outages or certain problems that organizations experience on the physical layer could from time to time actually result in financial loss. And in this particular case, Capitec actually had to refund a lot of their of their banking clients for the outages that occurred over a 2-year period. So financial losses is for sure, but what we also saw, literally less than a year later, Capitec was the most complained bank, in South Africa, complained about bank. You could maybe say it's not necessarily directly linked to the outages that they've experienced, but I'll, can bet my bottom dollar that a lot of people were very disgruntled. And we know when clients get disgruntled, they tend to voice their opinions on Facebook, on X, and it's sometimes more challenging for organizations to repair reputational damage than it is to actually cover for the outage that they've experienced. So in this particular case, you would then ask the next question to say, well, if we are still experiencing outages, where can we go and have a look and see if we can actually pin the areas where these outages occur? And part of the data center survey actually asked a number of organizations to go and do a bit more of an autopsy, to actually go and, to go and try and understand what the root cause was for their outage. And lo and behold, I think it's not a surprise for many that power still contributes to 52% of data center issues and outages. And I think it's quite self-explanatory. Power is the lifeline. Without power, you can't do anything. Even your cooling systems would obviously fall over. And funny enough, cooling systems actually contributed to the second most, fingered category, if you want to call it that actually ended up causing data center issues. One of the surprising areas that we started noticing is that 9% of failures actually happened in somebody else's facility. So it was actually a third-party provider, a hosting organization or a co-locator. And for the first time, the Uptime Institute is watching this quite closely, because for CIOs and for data center managers that thought that they would move their workloads into a co-locator site and mitigate all the risk, well, surprise, this is not the case. We are actually starting to see, a fair amount of failures that are happening even from a third-party supplier's perspective. Then, of course, cybersecurity. So, we're not cybersecurity experts, but we look at the data center and IT holistically. Cybersecurity threats are something that we also monitor quite closely. It's not necessarily registered on our outage report, but we do actually make mention of that in the report itself. And you are really as strong, your security is really as strong as your weakest link. We don't, at this particular point in Uptime, look at cyber threats from a physical perspective, but obviously it is something that organizations need to seriously take into consideration as part of the resilience strategy, right? So we're building here a case to actually prove that it's multifaceted. Resilience within the data center needs to be covered from all angles, including obviously security. Interesting document that I also got from Tech Central not so long ago is that Dropbox, who we all know, were actually targeted and there was a security breach. Just proving again that a lot of these things and these attacks are actually closer to home, and many organizations try and protect themselves and try and understand how levels of resilience need to be increased from a cybersecurity perspective. So what do people do then to actually increase their resilience? It looks like people are investing more money in bringing in greater levels of redundancy. UPS and power is normally where people invest in the data center space. And this was pretty much the question that we asked was where did you spend the money? And if you look at the breakout here, you'd actually find that everybody from cloud to co-locator ended up spending on the power and cooling front, because that is fundamentally the areas where we saw in the previous slides vulnerabilities within obviously your strategies. So then we also started seeing the way in which the market is addressing these is that they're starting to do a level of self-assessment or independent assessments. So it's still a good idea to have this as part of your strategy, to actually bring organizations in, to let them do some form of an assessment on your data center, some form of gap analysis to help you understand where the issues and the risks lie. And from an Uptime perspective, we've helped numerous organizations actually do some form of a gap analysis. And it's a lot easier if you know where the gaps are to actually bridge them to strengthen your resilience within your facilities. So it's quite interesting here to see that 89% of the participants actually do self-assessments or some form of assessment at a regular stage, but quite staggering that 11% of the participants don't do any form of assessment whatsoever. So it's quite astonishing to see. Then the next level of assessment or impact analysis, if you want to call it that, is where people do a post-mortem to try and find out where the data center issues came in, what ultimately caused the failure. And I think it's quite obvious that in today's time, there's multiple layers within your IT, and that some of these failures could actually happen higher up in the stack. The classic example is obviously people that cannot access a specific application due to an issue on your IT layer. It's got nothing to do necessarily with the UPS or with your power system down in your data center. So impact analysis is also something that we can recommend and that we ask organizations to take into consideration when they put their IT resilience strategies together. The interesting part is that a lot of IT managers actually come to us to talk about standards and how can standards help them mitigate the risk. What do they need to do to actually implement new systems that will allow certain levels of business continuity? How will new legislation and disruptive technologies, etc., actually have an impact on their businesses? How do they benchmark their facilities? A standard allows you to actually benchmark your facility with another facility in terms of its resilience levels. And last, how do we do this, obviously, in a sustainable way? And where we feel as organization, you should actually look at the standard first as the starting point upon which your resilience strategy should be built as you move up higher in the IT stack. Just to give you an example how the markets are responding at the moment towards standards, this is just an example. Obviously, Nigeria is part of my region. The Central Bank of Nigeria has launched what we call an IT blueprint or white paper, where they made standards recommendations to the financial institutions in Nigeria. You'll see that the Uptime does actually feature here under data centers as the tier standards. But I think this is an area where the IT professionals can actually get involved by helping, to write forms of blueprints, which would, at a later stage, actually become legislation to actually force people to act in a particular direction to ensure that we can actually build data centers with high levels of resilience, especially for the financial institutions. And we found that this was quite lacking in South Africa. There are guidelines, but people are not necessarily inclined to follow them because there's no real repercussions. So we've got the National Credit Acts, and there are some other regulatory bodies out there, but it's not necessarily pushed and forced hard enough, according to us, to actually reach a standard of resilience. The other interesting factors that we are looking at is that so many people are moving into cloud computing, and this was quite interesting. People think that if they go into the cloud or if they are co-located somewhere else, that they can also pass the responsibility over to the co-locator, maybe the responsibility, but the accountability will still be with the organization. And it's quite amazing that out of the 168 participants that we interviewed in terms of third-party IT providers, 42% of them actually experienced an outage in 2023. And it's quite interesting to see that it was linked to software and the networking layer. So it's not always that easy just to forklift your workloads into the cloud and to think that it's going to be happy days and that you will be able to mitigate all the risk, of course. Another interesting area that we would recommend you monitor is what we call the DORA Act. The DORA Act was underwritten by the European Commission. It is new legislation that was released in the European, under the European Union financial institutions, and that will allow a financial institution to audit a cloud provider or a co-locator site, because these guys were not that transparent in the past. They did not necessarily open up their facilities for their clients to come and evaluate and to come and check, obviously, the level of business continuity or the level of tiering that they always claimed that they had. So this is quite interesting to see that in the past there were a lot of talk around this, but in Europe at the moment, these type of legislative laws are actually coming into place that will force the IT managers in a lot of respects to become more auditable. And that means that you've got to open up and actually prove the levels of resilience within your physical infrastructure. So this is just some further feedback. I would obviously recommend that you go and do a bit of reading on this. We are anticipating that a lot of the the ways in which these legislative guidance papers are written would actually come to South Africa. Normally what happens is South Africa becomes sort of a, how can I say, test ground before it moves into the rest of Africa. And it would be quite interesting to see how many of the participants here today actually have had exposure to forms of legislation that will force you to adhere to a certain level of resilience within your data center facility, especially the guys obviously in the financial institutions. So if it's not enough, the challenges that we have on the resilience side and making sure that our systems are resilient, we are starting to see a lot of pressure on CIOs to also do this in a sustainable manner. And this impacts everything from procurement all the way through to server efficiencies. And this, the additional curveball, if I can call it this, that are thrown towards the CIO just makes his life so much more complex and so much more, how can I say, challenging, to report carbon footprint and carbon footprint reduction initiatives from the data center side. Part of the challenge is, who do we go with in terms of standards? And a lot of CIOs in South Africa are talking about ISO 50001. But if you look at what the work we've done is we've actually collected information on probably over 100 organizations that can claim that they can help you with some form of sustainability and benchmarking, which makes it even more challenging, because what do you use as a measure? If you're a CIO that's been using PUE to, which is a very good measure, but it's getting a little bit outdated, then you would actually find, how do you actually wrap up the aspects of your data center that needs measurement, and where do you actually then report these? So we're starting to see a lot more deployment of data center infrastructure management and building management systems integration, so that IT and facilities can start working together. But it is a very, very complex structure, and it is a, how can I say, a challenge for CIOs and organizations. And I guess that's why we're seeing so many ESG managers being employed, because it becomes a full-time job to report back to the board in terms of what your sustainability initiatives are. Right. So we spoke about the measures. Today, it's quite easy to walk to a CIO and get some form of PUE. Majority of the large data centers would be able to give that through to you. It's very easy for them to do some form of server utilization measure, so that is a metrics that's actually used quite frequently. But when we start touching on the measures and the metrics as used to report the sustainability angle, it becomes a lot more challenging, and you can actually see how the numbers dwindle down to people actually reporting, effectively reporting carbon footprint and carbon footprint reduction initiatives. And it's purely because standard to align themselves to, and this is hopefully where the Uptime in the future would be able to bring some of these standards together and make it a lot easier for data center managers to align the resilience measures with what the organization would require in terms of sustainability as well. Right. Everybody thinks AI will be the rescue of a lot of our IT challenges and our resilience problems. I think you guys are quite advanced in terms of your thought processes around AI. I think the industry is becoming a lot more mature. The adoption rate for AI is cautious, but it is definitely picking up. But these points I actually got from a very interesting IBM site, and I would recommend that you guys go and have a look. IBM's got a very open policy, and they actually have a framework around what is AI and the ethics around that. And I think from a data center perspective, there is a bit of a trust issue in AI. And as you can see from the next slide, we actually asked a number of data center operators, would you trust artificial intelligence to make operations decisions in your data center? And in 2022, 24% of the participants said no. And in 2023, 37% of the participants said no, they won't. So from a physical infrastructure perspective, I think we've got quite a distance to go. I think there are some areas that we need to bridge ethically. And I think there is definitely a fear factor in AI where people feel that artificial intelligence would actually replace them and replace their jobs in the future. And as you can see from the next slide, this is actually the case where we actually asked a number of people, do you believe artificial intelligence will reduce your data center operations staffing levels pretty much in the future? And we actually saw this middle column from 42 to 48% increase in those who said yes, but they do reckon it's going to be 5 years or longer before that happens. So there's a bit of a trust factor. There's an ethical dilemma that we need to overcome. There are a few critical aspects within AI. I think that the entire world is waiting to see what the full impact it would be on the data center space in particular. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, I hope I haven't given you a bit of a headache. Maybe there was a lot of information to ponder on. I think from an ethics standards for AI all the way through to resiliency standards within the data center space, Uptime Institute, see where the industry is going. You're welcome to go and download that white paper from our website. It's absolutely free. And we would be able to guide you in terms of best practice, especially on the data center physical infrastructure remit. So with that, Quinton, I think we can open the floor for some questions.
Great, thanks, Eben. So let me just get back on the screen. Yeah. So I see. I don't know if this is a question or an answer, but I assume this is Tony. So he was saying, yeah, they say the greatest thing about standards is that there are so many of them. So how do managers and CIOs determine what is likely to be the most appropriate for their environment?
So that's a very, very challenging question. I think I think that's really the problem with a lot of standards is that organizations find it difficult to align that with their own organizational objectives. I think it's very important that CIOs and data center managers should look at what the desired outcome is. They should try and align themselves with the standard that will bring them in line with that measurement. You must remember that standards bring conformity as well. So if you want to conform, with best practice, then look for the standard that aligns with your organization and the organizational objectives. Luckily, from a data center tiering perspective, there are only a certain amount of resilience levels. So that's easy enough. You can decide if you want to be tier 3 or tier 4. But it is a conundrum, and I think a lot of people avoid standards sometimes as far as they can because it is so complex. Do I go with ISO? Do I go with BREEAM for my data? For my building? Am I part of the green grid? How do I measure? It's a challenge. So my very high level answer would be to look at your desired outcome and select the standard that's going to bring you, to that level.
Great. I'd make a comment. Some of the standards that we talk to customers about, there's all these sustainability certifications, and you can be an A, a B, a C, or an A+. And if it's not enforced, sometimes it's good enough just to assess the market around you and just try and one up your competitors, and not necessarily go for the AAA 5-star rating if everybody, your peers, are still sitting at a C, right? So I guess there's also this cost benefit assessment you need to do as well.
There are a lot of self-remedy to a point before you need to bring in some of the experts. What we see in the industry is that the optimization of systems can be achieved up to a point where you're going to look at redesigning your data center. I mean, you could you can tweak around with cooling systems to improve your energy efficiency. You can you can deploy more energy efficient servers, but it's a holistic view, and ultimately, if you haven't done a data center assessment or proper audit, it becomes difficult to pinpoint the areas and levers that you can pull, to optimize systems. So majority of the data centers are pretty optimized. In the older data centers, it could be as easy as actually retiring, legacy kit. You'll be surprised how many people still run, outdated servers. They don't even know what applications are on those. But that's probably where PUE would also become quite a nice measure. And PUE is a cheap thing to achieve. You put a couple of sensors and you monitor, the utilization. And it's a quick and easy thing to do. That's maybe why it's so popular.
Just for the rest of the audience, just the abbreviation PUE. It's just
power utilization effectiveness.
Okay.
It's a ratio between what the IT power uses versus the entire facility. Obviously, when you start optimizing the IT, the ratio actually becomes better. So very interesting. The Germans now have brought out legislation that if you're in the data center industry and if you want to call yourself probably a multi-tenant or a co-locator, your PUE must be 1.3 or better by 2028. That's quite a tall ask, but that's exactly probably where South Africa is going to start moving as well. We'll have white papers and legislation urging people to become more energy efficient and to become more conscious about carbon footprint, until it gets to a point where now it's legislation. So people will have to act to make their facilities a lot more efficient.
Okay, good. So we got another question from Josine. She says, great to see that sustainability is a major consideration. I understand that containing at best the carbon and e-waste footprint is a huge headache for data center managers. I recently read that China is experimenting with data centers on the seabed. What are your thoughts about that?
Very, very interesting. We get that quite a lot. Microsoft played with an experiment where they also dumped, sort of a container data center onto the seabed. I think the only benefit that you would really get out of with a system like that is cooling is a major problem. So, if you can harness chilled water from somewhere, and it comes from the seabed, that's a natural plus, right? There are all sorts of environmental impact and impact studies that need to be done when you start playing around with those sort of things, and that's probably why the whole world has not rushed to occupy a piece of the seabed. A lot of people were moving to Greenland and countries with naturally colder environments to help with cooling. It's going to be an interesting discussion. We're seeing with AI, we are going to see higher power densities. We're going to see greater rack densities. As I mentioned in the presentation, we saw rack densities of 70 kilowatts plus already. So how do you cool that? And that's where liquid cooling, direct liquid cooling or on-chip cooling would become quite prevalent, I guess. There's really no other way of doing that. But then you need a flow of heat exchanging and chilled water. You need a lot of cooling for that.
Yep.
So interesting question. A lot of people were experimenting with that. Various different results. Not necessarily the silver bullet, I would say.
And I guess there's also the debate about how far away you put the compute, right, to where you want to consume all of this the output of this data processing. So we move everything to Greenland, we got to increase the ability to transport all that data there.
Of course, and then all sorts of People Information, Privacy of Information Acts, where are the information kept, all that sort of POPI Act challenges would come into play. You'll also have latency challenges in certain cases. But yes, it's an interesting concept. We don't see too many of those. I think people are trying various methods of improving data center cooling and efficiencies in particular.
So I haven't seen another question, so I'm going to ask one. Actually, I have a couple of questions that I wrote down here while you were presenting. You mentioned that 9% increase or the contribution of third-party or co-location infrastructure. Correct. That is now contributing to outages. Is there any study that you've done on is it because there's a bigger adoption of co-location? You talk about where the responsibility lies, and sometimes having a professional hosted infrastructure is still better than trying to build your own. So is there a parallel that can be drawn between the adoption of colo as well as that increase in outages?
It could well be, because I think smaller data centers find it a lot easier to go and rent some space. It's just a lot easier to do so. So the ratio could be affected by the sheer amount of people in a facility that was knocked by the same time, if you understand what I'm saying. But I think the criticality behind that number is that in the past a data center manager or a CIO decided to go to a co-location because of a specific SLA that he would have signed with levels of business continuity that was guaranteed to the business. And because there's not necessarily a level of transparency. So these guys played their cards very close to their chest, but legislation in certain countries like the DORA Act are now forcing people to open up their facilities. So what I'm trying to say is that sometimes I think you were in a tier 3 facility, but you were actually in something less than that. That could have been that could have been one argument. But the fact that people think that it's always easier and better not to have stuff on-prem, because that was really the discussion, right? Do we have on-prem, or do we have off-prem, or do we have a hybrid data center? So it's quite amazing how many people now go for a hybrid configuration. Especially some of the banks tend to pull back now and actually have core banking on-prem, and then have some form of a DR in a tier 3 hosted facility somewhere, because they just feel that there's a lot more control. So I think it's a combination of transparency, control, auditability that wasn't necessarily there in the past, and that's why legislation is starting to force these guys to open up.
Okay. Tony, do you want to ask a question?
Thanks, Quinton, and actually related to what you've just been talking about, Eben. As an ex-CIO myself, we're seeing a lot of talk about migration into the cloud and so on. So whether you talk on-prem, off-prem, at the end of the day, a lot of businesses actually don't have data centers anymore. They rent their services, if you like. And as a matter, so I mean, it's fine if you're a data center manager working for one of the organizations that provides those services. But if you're looking, after a company, whether you're the CIO or some other senior executive, my question is, how does one give oneself assurance that the data center that you're working with, because you're working in the cloud, provides, the right levels of sustainability and so on and so forth? You mentioned that power is a big issue. Well, in South Africa, heck, we know that. And I think for me, if we look at it from a risk management perspective, how does a manager or a CIO manage the risk of their organization in terms of the services being provided by a data center that isn't theirs, and they actually don't
Yeah.
really have sight of.
Yeah. So what we've been doing for clients lately is independent assessments. So you have the right to go to your cloud provider and to actually question the infrastructure. Yeah, you've got the right to question the level of business continuity that they need to guarantee. And we are seeing more organizations, co-locators in particular, opening up for independent assessments. In fact, we've done some independent assessments with very big co-locators in South Africa on the back of a request of a financial institution. So I think the negotiating power and the muscling power will come back to the clients and not necessarily to the co-locators, if I can call it that, where clients through legislation would have sort of legal backing to say, but I want you to be more transparent. I want you to be more auditable. It's not just a case that we're going to accept that you call yourself tier 3. Were you independently assessed by the Uptime Institute? So I think those discussions sometimes become quite difficult, but they are needed, to protect clients that ultimately were told that they were going to receive a certain level of business continuity and resilience. And I think the market is maturing up to that, Tony, to be honest.
Do you have another question, Tony?
Sorry, no, I think rather there are a couple of questions, or there's at least another one from Josine, who, by the way, is the chair of our Social and Ethics Committee, a member of the board.
Right.
So just to position. But yeah, some good question there. So over to you, Quentin. Thanks.
Sure. So she says, thanks for that. Here's another question. Do you think that the companies are aware that cloud services still contribute to their own carbon and e-waste footprint to be reported on? I find that companies feel that by outsourcing, they think they improve their own ESG standing.
Yeah, very, very interesting too. A lot of people feel that it's not just the resilience that we can now do away with or mitigate, but it's also now the cloud provider's responsibility to be as green as possible. The interesting phenomena we're seeing in the industry is that people are now in Europe actually bidding before they go into cloud providers, and doing assessments to see who of these providers can actually provide me with the greenest possible service before they actually engage with them. I guess the dynamic will change quite dramatically. If we had some forms of sustainable energy providers in South Africa, but unfortunately, we've got one utility supplier, and we don't necessarily have the luxury to actually always pick and choose between co-locators. So we've got to do our homework. So we've got to go to these guys. We've got to understand what are their sustainability strategies, and where do they stand in terms of carbon footprint and the entire ecosystem around that, from suppliers right through to do they generate a level of energy themselves. So there's an interesting interesting dynamic in South Africa where a lot of the co-locators are now building solar farms in the Northern Cape to have a bit of an offset model.
Yep.
So that's probably the place where you would start, is to say, right, well, how much can you guarantee me in terms of my own sustainability strategy points towards the overall objective. Very interesting question. But yes, we don't always have, we're not spoiled by choice to pick greener energy providers, unfortunately, in South Africa. And therefore, just do your homework. Check the efficiencies on those, on the co-locators, and I guess their entire sustainability strategy.
Great, thanks for that answer. Anything else on the chat? So I'll throw my question out here. You were talking about AI and the feedback that not everybody is thinking AI is good to adopt, but I would argue that in many instances we've got AI implemented that we're not even aware of. And I threw the example out there of a lot of the network infrastructure today, the switches from Cisco as an example, have the ability to implement models that will be trained on what is perceived as known network traffic, and by doing that would be able to identify when there are exceptions and then alert you when you have unusual traffic on your network. And perhaps there are more examples, and it would be interesting to understand when you throw these questions out, who the audience is that you're asking these questions, and do they really understand the various levels of AI and the subsets of AI that are already being adopted.
Yeah. So from our perspective, AI is pretty much kept at an arm's length because it's not fully understood, and it's when people fear something, they tend to not embrace it as much, I guess, as what they should in a lot of cases. So just to give you an example, I mean, I've been speaking to a CIO in a financial institution that told me about a month ago that they are actually now running multiple Python scripts that was actually written by AI in their live production sites. So that probably happens a lot. I mean, there's nothing new, I guess. But what was quite astonishing is that these were created by junior devs. So you can have a person that can articulate himself very well in a Python language and can ultimately come up with an incredible piece of code. So the dilemma is now, where do you, the fear factor comes in, where you've got some senior people in organizations that will see this now as a risk. So I think from a data center perspective, the question really was, and the question and the survey was touching, when will AI start making operational decisions? So in other words, when would artificial intelligence be, excuse the pun, clever enough to realize that I've got to up the set point of this particular air conditioning unit, to optimize my energy efficiency according to the IT load that's being and data, etc., that's being processed. So ultimately, when will we reach that point where people would or could be out of jobs? What I'm saying.
Yeah.
So
yeah. Well, I think a couple of years ago we had this conversation about learning models and at what point would we trust the system to make autonomous decisions. And I think in many instances we're still at that situation where we have the tool, it will notify you that you need to change that set point, as an example, but it still requires the human intervention to accept the decision. So we still have that. We're playing a supervisory role on these platforms at this stage. Josine has thrown us another question. So she's saying, do data centers experience skill shortages when looking for new employees? And if so, how do they deal with this? I suppose we could argue that the AI could solve the problem.
It's not necessarily aiding the problem. The data center industry is massively underskilled, and if you're a good operator, you'll probably be snatched up by some of the big boys. It's quite amazing how people move between Microsoft and Amazon and some of the bigger boys, purely because there is a skills shortage, and it's something that the Uptime is trying to address through data center academies. We've got a couple of very interesting training programs where we're going to, where we not just try and train somebody, but we actually try and put him into some form of a apprenticeship So it's a lot easier to put somebody into a site that's been certified because things have been done correctly. But to answer the question, South Africa is massively understaffed, underskilled, and the data center managers will tell you that. So it's something that we're also talking to some of the universities. If you take somebody raw from a university, he might be quite a good mechanical or electrical engineer, but when you put him into the data center remit, as I said earlier in my presentation, you've got to look at it holistically. It's quite complex, to get these guys to understand, resilience and to understand topology takes some time. We've got some very good design companies in South Africa, make no mistake. I mean, we design some of the best data centers on the Africa continent. But if you look at operations, 70%, another interesting statistic that also come from us, 70% of unwanted downtime is due to human error. So, you could have a fantastic facility, but if your switching procedures are not necessarily at the right place at the right time, if your staff is, relatively ignorant about certain pieces of equipment, when you're under pressure, you make mistakes. And unfortunately, they then tend to down certain areas in the data center, which obviously causes unwanted downtime. So yes, it's a serious issue, and of course I think we all need to take hands and try and see how we can get these academies off the ground.
Great, thanks for that, Eben. So we're just about on time. I'd like to thank you again for joining us today and sharing this, having this insightful discussion with us. It's greatly appreciated. And thanks to the audience who took the time to join today and the many interesting questions that they threw at you. I have no doubt that we could continue talking for another hour if we let it continue. But yeah, so really thanks very much for the time today. I'd like to remind the audience that this is a CPD accredited session, so don't forget to log into your IITPSA portal and submit your attendance for the session today. And have a good evening, and we'll see you in one of our future webinars.